Good morning, everyone. Hope you're having a good day and good week so far. Hey, I'm Randy with Master Books, and today for teaching tips, what we're going to talk about is creativity. Not something that we normally think about too much when we're talking about education because we're often pursuing academic pursuits. But what I'd like to do by the end of today's tip is to really have you just thinking about the importance of creativity, and is it part of your school? Is it not part of your school? How can we begin to talk that forward? And we'll do a couple more teaching tips based on creativity and how to foster that in your school. So the case for creativity. Why is it a skill? I would say it's a skill as important as literacy, a skill as important as academic achievement. I think it's actually the foundation to academic achievement. Part of it is because of the unpredictability of the world we live in today. A student who is starting school today, right? If I started kindergarten this year, I'm looking at retiring, if the world stayed the same, I'm looking at retired in the year 2080. So think of that. Starting kindergarten today, retirement is 2080. And what we're trying to do as parents and educators is to train our children and prepare them and equip them for a life of working and employment and all of these things from now to the year 2080. The reality is most of us don't even know what next year is going to look like. It's hard enough to be prepared for next year, let alone being prepared for the future, right? I mean, how do you prepare for the year 2080? So what we're looking at is we've got to give them some skills that help them be creative. The leaders of today, the influencers of today, those people today that are making an effect on culture, which each of our children, I believe in the homeschool movement, have a calling on their life to impact culture and make a change. They're going to need to be creative, but the leaders today are creatives. They're the ones who think creatively. They're the ones who are solving problems creatively. They're not necessarily conforming to what always was. They're beginning to question and challenge and be creative. So the first reason that I would make an argument for creativity and the need for it is the unpredictability of the world that we live in. Creative people need to be able to look at the circumstances and be creative about solving problems, leading those around them and those challenges. The second thing that I would say is capacity. We are created with the capacity to be creative. Why do I say that? I believe we are made in the image of God. The first thing that God revealed about himself in scripture to me and to you is, in the beginning, God created. His very character, the first thing he reveals to us is that he's creative. And that and being made in his image, it's interesting because he gave us capacity to create. Like, we're governed by the laws that he established to the universe, right? Gravity holds me here, and there's certain things that are laws, but within those laws, we have this amazing ability to be creative. And we're born with that. Children are very creative. They're very inventive. They're imaginative. We work that out of them as the older they get. But I believe we have the capacity. And creativeness isn't something that you don't have and lose. Some people will say, well, I'm just not very creative. Why? Because you can't do an art project, or because you're not crafty. But creativity is much more than just arts and crafts, right? So if you're here, be sure to comment and let me know that you're here. You can cheer or challenge. It's all good. But so we have this capacity that's born into us to be creative. So what happens? The third thing that I would say is the conformity. Once we start school, or even beyond, before that, right, in our home situations, in church, but in school, value is given on conformity. If you take a classroom of students and there's 20 students in the classroom, what students are A+ students? Is it the creative students, or is it the students that are able to conform and show academic abilities? I tell you what to think. If you can repeat it back to me successfully, I'll give you an A. And I will reward you for conforming to what I've said. And so I think we have to realize that in our schooling, we want to be careful because, while academic ability is very important, we have to be careful that we also allow room for students to be creative and express themselves a little bit. It's not always easy, right? Us parents, we're notorious for our own insecurities becoming the limits of our children's expressions. What will people think? How I'm trying to conform here. I want people to think that everything is perfect, and so it's hard to give room for mistakes. It's hard to give room for children to express themselves, because what I'm looking for is for my children to be perfect, right? Made in somebody else's image than my own. I want them to be perfect. I remember a very young child. I grew up in a pastor's home, and I can remember my parents saying, okay, and you have to understand, I probably was a very creative child, and there were limits, right? So I'm not saying that, but I can remember one night being talked to on the way to church, and my parents said, you are to be the church mouse. That's what you're to be known as, the church mouse. You are to be seen here and not heard. Seen and not heard. That was the role that I was supposed to take at the church. And you know what? It took 40 years for me to begin to open up and express my creativity. And it was a hard battle, because I had learned to conform to the expectation that my creativity, my expression of what God had placed into me, was not something to be valued by adults. And the way that adults valued me was if I would shut down and just be seen and not heard. So there's this balance, right? And I think we have to follow the leading of the Lord in that balance. But the academic system and the way it's set up is the emphasis is so heavy on academics and so heavy on testing and conformity to what we want the child to think, as opposed to allowing the child to look at a subject, think about the subject. What I really like about a lot of master books is it's more real world application. So here's the way this works in the real world, here's the information, but then there's opportunity to think about things in discussion. And we see this conflict, a paradigm conflict, with subjects like our American history and our world history in high school especially, where we're saying, this is what happened, why do you think this happened? And people are so used to, but I can't conform to an open-ended question like that. We want them to be creative. We want them to think through these subjects and begin to express themselves, as opposed to being told what to think. Why did the Civil War happen? Let's think about it. Let's be creative about it. Let's try to understand the sides, as opposed to this is why it happened. Absolute truth is the Word of God. Outside of that, as far as like history goes and different things, there's so much room for interpretation. There's so much room for biases. There's so much room. And part of being creative and thinking critically and solving problems is the ability to step outside that and begin to evaluate and look at those. So conformity is built into the academic system. It's built into the psyche of most of us as parents. And we have to begin to think, am I forcing my child into conformity with my desires? And especially for us as homeschoolers, I think we have to be kind of careful of this, because we are so we're their only influence in most cases. And so it's very easy for us to impose our boxes on our children and not give them room to be creative and expressive. So, okay. The fourth item that I would say is the culture is, okay, so culture is one of the most important things we can do to foster creativity, and we're going to talk more about it in future teaching tips. But just kind of to provoke some thought, right? Are our homes and is our schoolroom and the experience that we have, does it give room for mistakes? Does it allow our children to get outside the box, explore a little bit, maybe get bruised and bumped up, maybe make a few mistakes? Or do we just try to keep them in that box and keep the lid on it as tight as possible, either because of our fears or insecurities, or just because we don't know any better than let's let them begin to be creative in their world? You know, there's so much pressure on our students to perform academically, and sometimes play. I notice sometimes with my kids, they struggle to just play. And it's so nice when they do all of a sudden take off and they're beginning to build things. And I think about when I was a kid, how rich I had it, because I was able to, build forts and build go-karts and build all the time. I was building, but I didn't have technology. Technology just didn't exist the way that it does today. So that's part of the culture that we create, is a place where they have opportunities to create. In our home, we have, Kristen does a good job of having kind of a lot of art related type stuff. She has a scrapbook area. She's been good about sharing things with the kids as long as they respect it. There's we have a lot of instruments and music at the house, and they're encouraged if they want to begin learning instruments and learning music to do that. But beyond that, even just thinking creatively about problems that present our family and talking through those from a creative aspect and problem solving and that type of thing. Thinking creatively helps the brain engage the multiple parts of the brain, and students perform better in other areas of analytics and problem solving skills and those type of things. But I think beyond that, it gives them the capacity to begin looking to solve problems and influence culture. So in business, the best performing teams in the world, there are studies that have been done about the best performing teams of the world. And sometimes people would say, well, the way you build the best team in the world, a business team, is you assemble the best minds. And then that's how you create the change in teams. But that actually isn't true. The best teams in the world, the hallmark of the best teams is actually safety. That there's trust involved, that if I step out a little bit and I make a suggestion, even if it's a mistake, I'm not going to be slaughtered for making that mistake. We realize that we learn from our mistakes and we grow from our mistakes. And as much as we grow from our successes, we grow sometimes more from the mistakes. Those are the things that shape us. And so that culture as parents of allowing our kids to step out a little bit and make some mistakes, partnering with the Holy Spirit to say, give me wisdom to know when to let go a little bit and when to keep the box shut, because it's hard as a parent, isn't it? It's hard to know when to let them out and when to keep the box closed, because we don't want to see them hurt. But at the same time, if they don't get hurt and they don't experience a little bit of that, that comes with stepping outside the box, then they may never know what that's like. So unpredictability, the world's an unpredictable place. Capacity, we are made in the image of God. Conformity, built into the academic culture, is a desire to make us conform. We need to be aware of that and fight that. And then culture, we need to create a culture that nurtures creativity. The last is courage. Being creative requires courage. I don't know if you know this, and some of us may tremble at the thought of stepping outside of a cultural norm, of being a little bit different. And it's hard. It's hard because from a young age, we're trained that if we look different or we act different or we behave different or do something different, that culture is going to beat us back into the box. And it takes courage to be creative. Maybe the song doesn't sound like everybody else's. Maybe the art doesn't look like everybody else's. Maybe there are sometimes you just take the picture and rather than coloring inside the lines, only color outside the lines. just to be a little bit different. Sometimes that takes a lot of courage. One example, Master Books, a lot of the desire that I hope we have is that we change the narrative in homeschooling. Over a lot of years of working with families who've homeschooled, we've just seen these friction points. We've seen families get discouraged because there's, the curriculum doesn't fit their family. We've seen parent and child relationships. It's just constant tension and friction in the marriage. And a lot of times it comes down to, it's just a poor curriculum choice. It's a curriculum that wasn't designed for homeschooling or whatever. And there's no one size fits all. So we know that. But if you're using Master Books and it's working, you get what I'm talking about, right? It helps remove some of these friction points that we had experienced for years. And so it takes a little bit of this and a little bit of that helps. But one of the things we wanted to do is begin changing the narrative so that in homeschooling, instead of it just being, these are the standards and we all have to conform to what the standards are, we begin defining a little bit, this is how a child learns and they're individuals, and we want to foster creativity. We want to encourage their faith and the awe and wonder of the Creator, because we believe that they have a purpose. And so we're not educating towards college, even though college may be a wonderful thing. We're educating them for life. And we're looking at homeschooling in the real world because families aren't in a bubble. We don't live in a vacuum, and we have influences, sickness and cancers and just stress and job changes, moves across country, all these things that affect our families. And so you want to be as adaptable to real life as possible. And so we look at our solutions in ways that can real families use this with real kids. In situations where you have 6 kids and maybe you've got, you're sick from pregnancy hormones, or you're nursing babies while you're trying to keep families going in businesses and ministries and you name it, all these stresses. And so we looked at, how can we do this? How can we create curriculums that really foster success in a real family? And it takes an amazing amount of courage to stand in the arena while you have the skeptics saying, well, it's not as rigorous, it's not enough. Now, we know academically it is. Parents have taken the standardized test scores. We encourage you to. I encouraged you last week. I'm going to encourage it again. $30, get your kid tested if you have any doubts. So we know that. We know the success is coming in from families because we see it all the time. It doesn't work for every family, but the families that it does work for, it's working remarkably well. So when you create a curriculum, like here's a good example, the Math K. I've seen this come up in posts, and I have to laugh because a lot of times it'll be, well, we've used this curriculum. It didn't work for our family. So we're trying to use Math K, but I'm concerned that it's not enough. Now, what my response is, well, Math K is a different approach. It's looking at a more holistic part of a child. And it says, is the brain fully developed? Have we worked out the skills that are needed to do higher level mathematics? Do we understand contrast? Do we understand differences? Do we understand, the basic things that a child needs to do math? So they'll say, this program didn't work, and this program is working, like my kid likes math and they're blowing through it and it's doing great, but I have this feeling. My response is, but we don't want to be like such and such. There's already such and such in the market. If that's working, stay with it. But if it's not working, we have a solution that we feel adapts to the child to where it is. And so we didn't create this to compete directly with such and such. We created it because our desire is to produce curriculum for real students in the real world. And this is the approach that we feel will help prepare your child to move forward in mathematics with a solid foundation. And the question that I have sometimes is, well, who said they had got it right? Who said such and such was right? Right? I mean, how we default to a certain mechanism of conformity in comparing and contrast. And I think the courage sometimes to step out is to say, but I don't want to be you. I don't want to look like you. I don't want my school to be like yours. I don't want my kids to look like yours. I want my kids to be unique. I want my kids to be creative. I want my kids to come from a culture where they believe that God has given them certain skills and abilities that nobody else has for such a time as this, so that they can influence culture and influence the world. They're not going to get that by conforming to what you think my family should be. They're not going to get that by conforming to what the standards that the national education system says. Now, it's important as homeschoolers that we meet our standards. It's important that we abide by the laws. So don't mistake me there. But we can be creative in giving our children an education that also nurtures and fosters creativity in them. It's hard sometimes, right? Because sometimes your creative students, we tend to get frustrated with easy. I'll end with a story I just heard, there was a young girl who was in a school, and by today's standards, they would have said that she had ADHD because she was just fidgety and she couldn't sit still and she had to move. And the principal called the parents in, and he said, we need to talk about your daughter's behavior in the schoolroom. Let's go out and talk. And when he did, he turned the radio on in his office and he took the parents out. And while they were standing outside, they watched, and this little girl began to dance in the office. And the principal had such wisdom, because he said to the parents, he said, your child isn't broken. She just needs to dance. She's physical. She needs to move as she's learning. And you need to take her out of this school, which places an emphasis on academic achievement, and you need to put her into a school of dance. And so they did. And the moment she stepped into that environment, she said, there were all these people who understood that through movement and through expressing themselves physically, they were learning and they were growing. And suddenly this person who would have been labeled as a failure because they didn't get an A+ and they couldn't sit still in that environment, was able to move into an environment which fostered a creative opportunity for her physically. And she ended up becoming quite famous, and as a dancer, and as a producer, and ended up, very wealthy and well-to-do. But it would have been a completely different story if they had said, no, she doesn't fit in the box, so we're going to close it and shut it down. And I sometimes watch the conversations in this group, and I feel that it's important that we sometimes open the box up a little bit. And just because Johnny doesn't want to sit there all day long, I have to sit at a desk all day long. And there are days that it just about drives me insane. Like, I have to be moving. I have to move. I have to get out of here. So I go to the warehouse with my notepad, and I start brainstorming and thinking, and I walk around the racks, and I just have to do that once or twice a day to move. Because what person, and I commented on a post earlier as well on this, we take a kid who's 5, 6, 7 years old, we put them at a desk for 6 to 8 hours, and then we send them home and make them work all night long doing the lowest level clerical tasks, right? Mathematics, days and hours on end. And then we get frustrated because the children are children. They need to move, they need to play, they need to be children, they need to create, because that's who God created them to be. And I don't think we should always be fighting to put them in a box of conformity and taking away the creativity. The world needs creatives. The Christian world especially needs creatives. We need culture. We need Christians who will change culture, not conform to culture, who will change culture and be creative to be able to present the gospel message in ways that the world will take notice. We don't need more conformists. We don't need more people who can go to church on Sunday morning, sit and listen to the message, and go home and not think another thing about it. All right? Okay, so next week we'll talk about maybe some ideas to help foster creativity in our homes. And I just want to say, for anybody who says, but I'm not creative. Yes, you are. You were created in the image of God. It's like sometimes it may lie dormant, but trust me, if you begin to give yourself a little bit of opportunity to be creative and think creatively, it's not all about art. It's about finding ways to solve problems, to create. As parents, we have to be creative all the time. As home educators, we're creating all the time. It's not about pretty logos on walls and pictures and Instagram photos. It's about being creative and creating. It's solving problems. Okay, I hope this is an encouragement to you. Those are the 5 points that I would make to make a case for creativity in your homeschool, an appeal, if you will. And next week, let's start talking about how to actually start flexing the creative muscles a little bit. And please be sure to comment on this video. I really want to know your thoughts and the challenges you have so we can continue to address them and talk about them in future teaching tips. Hey guys, God bless you. Have a great week. And I pray that your mind is opened up to the possibility of beginning to create individually and as a family, and to begin to create change that influences culture. God bless you guys.